The millionaire showed me a picture of his son. And I, the maid, told him something about that child he wasn't ready to hear. It was the first time I saw his family as something fragile, not untouchable. I felt a bitterness so sharp it almost tasted like tears. Maybe you're working for someone who never says thank you or cleaning up while everyone else sleeps. Tell me, where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? I promise today's story will touch your heart. My name is Margaret Rose Thompson, and I'm 58 years old. For 7 long years, I've been the invisible woman in a Manhattan penthouse worth more than most people see in a lifetime. Every morning at 5:30, I slip through the service entrance of this glass tower on the Upper East Side, ride the freight elevator to the 32nd floor, and enter a world that glitters with marble, crystal, and cold indifference. The Caldwell family owns this fortress in the sky. Thomas Caldwell made his fortune by investing in stocks on the stock market, building a vast empire that spans from real estate to cryptocurrency. There was so much money involved that part of it was even held in Bitcoin, digital wealth numbers on screens that I could never understand. Their net worth seemed endless, measured not just in dollars but in the power to make people like me disappear with a wave of their manicured hands. I wear the same gray uniform every day, starched collar frayed from countless washings, my hands cracked and spotted from years of scrubbing their imported Italian tile floors. The apartment sprawls across 4,000 square feet, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park. Rooms so pristine they feel more like museum displays than places where real people live. I move through these spaces like a ghost, my soft-soled shoes silent on the polished surfaces, careful never to disturb the perfect symmetry of their carefully curated life. That particular Tuesday morning started like any other. I prepared Mr. Caldwell's coffee in the imported German machine that cost more than I make in 3 months. The aroma of Ethiopian beans filled the sterile kitchen while I arranged fresh orchids in the crystal vase by the window. Mrs. Victoria Caldwell had already left for her Pilates session, her designer heels clicking across the marble before the elevator whisked her away to another world of privilege and presumption. Thomas Caldwell emerged from his home office around 9, his silver hair perfectly styled, wearing a navy suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent. He was speaking into his phone about investments, corporate acquisitions, something about diversifying assets and maximizing returns. His voice carried that casual authority of someone who'd never doubted his place in the world, never wondered if he mattered. He noticed me dusting the grand piano, a Steinway that no one in the family actually played. It sat there like a beautiful, expensive silence, another symbol of wealth without purpose. Mr. Caldwell ended his call and approached me with something unusual in his expression. Not quite warmth, but a crack in his usual professional distance. "Margaret," he said, reaching into his breast pocket, "come here for a moment." I set down my cleaning cloth and walked over, my heart doing that familiar flutter it always did when any member of the family addressed me directly. In 7 years, our conversations had been limited to instructions about cleaning schedules, grocery lists, and the occasional complaint about dust on the baseboards. He pulled out his phone and showed me a photograph. The screen displayed a boy, maybe 9 or 10 years old, with dark hair like his father's and those same piercing blue eyes. But where Thomas Caldwell's gaze held cold calculation, this child's eyes seemed lost, almost desperate. The boy was wearing an expensive private school uniform, standing in front of what looked like a tennis court, but his smile appeared forced, like he was performing happiness rather than feeling it. "This is my son, David," Mr. Caldwell said, his voice carrying an unfamiliar note of vulnerability. "He's at boarding school in Connecticut. Exceptional institution, costs $40,000 a year, the best education money can buy." I looked at the photograph more carefully. The boy's shoulders were slightly hunched, his hands clenched at his sides. His smile didn't reach his eyes. In that frozen moment, I saw something Mr. Caldwell couldn't see, or maybe refused to see. I saw a child who looked exactly like my own grandson had looked 3 years ago, before we got him the help he needed. "He's beautiful," I said softly, which was true. But then something in that child's expression stirred something deep in my chest, a recognition that cut through years of trained silence. "Mr. Caldwell, can I ask you something? How is David doing with his reading?" The question hung in the air between us. Mr. Caldwell's face shifted slightly, a shadow crossing his features. "His reading? He's in an excellent academic program, the finest teachers money can provide. But I'd spent years watching children, years helping my sister raise her grandson after her daughter got into trouble with drugs. I knew that look in David's eyes. I'd seen it in the mirror on my grandson's face during those awful months when he struggled with letters that seemed to dance and jump on the page, when teachers called him lazy and classmates teased him for being slow. "Mr. Caldwell," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "that little boy looks like he might be having trouble with words. Sometimes children who are very smart get frustrated when letters don't make sense to them the way they should." The transformation in Thomas Caldwell's face was immediate and startling. The careful composure cracked, revealing something raw underneath. His hand tightened around the phone. "What are you suggesting, Margaret?" I should have stopped there. I should have apologized and gone back to my dusting. But looking at that child's photograph, thinking about my grandson's struggles and the years of pain that could have been avoided with earlier intervention, I couldn't stay silent. "I'm suggesting that maybe David needs a different kind of help, not more expensive tutors or fancier schools. Maybe he needs someone who understands that his brain works differently, and that's not a failure, it's just different." Mr. Caldwell stared at me for a long moment. In his eyes, I saw something I'd never seen before. Not anger exactly, but a kind of desperate fear. The fear of a man who'd built his fortune on reading markets and making calculated decisions, confronted with the possibility that his own son might struggle with the very foundation of academic success. "You're overstepping, Margaret," he said finally, his voice tight with controlled emotion. "You're the cleaning lady. You don't know anything about my son or what he needs." The words hit me like a slap, not because they were cruel. I'd endured much crueler words in this apartment, but because they revealed the fundamental truth of my existence here. I was furniture that occasionally spoke. I was useful, invisible, and entirely disposable. I nodded and returned to my dusting. But something had shifted irreversibly in that moment. For the first time in 7 years, I'd seen Thomas Caldwell as something other than an untouchable figure of wealth and authority. I'd seen him as a father who was failing his child, and that recognition changed everything. The rest of that day passed in a blur of routine tasks, but my mind kept returning to David's photograph. I thought about my own daughter, Sarah, now 28, and living in Philadelphia with her 2 children. Sarah, whom I'd barely seen, grow up because I was always here, always tending to someone else's family, always putting their needs before my own. I remembered missing Sarah's high school graduation because Mrs. Caldwell had insisted I stay late to prepare for a dinner party. I remembered the phone calls from Sarah's teachers that I couldn't answer because I was polishing silver or preparing elaborate meals for the Caldwell's business associates. I remembered the guilt that ate at me every night as I fell asleep in my small room at the back of the apartment, knowing that my daughter was raising herself while I raised someone else's family. That evening, as I prepared to leave, I found myself standing in front of the family portrait that dominated the living room wall. Thomas and Victoria Caldwell posed with perfect smiles, their assets and investments reflected in every expensive detail of the photograph. David wasn't in this portrait. It had been taken before his birth, or maybe he'd been at boarding school, already shipped away from the messy realities of family life. I studied Victoria's face in the portrait, remembering the woman who had hired me 7 years ago. She'd been different then, or maybe I'd been more hopeful. She'd spoken about wanting someone reliable, someone who could help manage their busy lives. She'd promised fair compensation, respect, and the possibility of being treated like part of the family. What a beautiful lie that had turned out to be. The early years had been filled with small compromises that felt reasonable at the time. Working late when they had business dinners, covering additional responsibilities when their previous housekeeper quit, accepting delayed payments when Mr. Caldwell's investments were tied up. Each concession had seemed minor, but together they'd built a prison of expectation and obligation. I thought about my bank account, which had never managed to grow beyond a few $100s despite 7 years of steady work. Every time I'd tried to save money, some crisis would arise. My sister's medical bills, my daughter's college expenses, my own mother's funeral costs 2 years ago. The Caldwells had been understanding about these emergencies, even generous with advances and small loans. But somehow, I never seemed to get ahead of the debt and obligation that kept me tethered to their world. My phone buzzed with a text message from Sarah. "Mom, can you call tonight? Emma has a recital tomorrow and she's asking if her grandmother will be there." Emma, my 6-year-old granddaughter, who barely knew me because I was always here, always available to the Caldwells but never available to my own family. I typed back, "Working late again, sweetheart. Give Emma my love." The lie came so easily now. I wasn't working late. I was simply trapped by the weight of years of small sacrifices that had accumulated into a mountain of resentment and exhaustion. I walked through the apartment one more time, checking that everything was perfect for tomorrow, that every surface gleamed and every detail met the Caldwells' exacting standards. As I prepared for bed in my small room, I caught my reflection in the mirror above the dresser. 58 years old, hair more gray than brown now, lines around my eyes that spoke of years spent squinting at other people's messes. When had I become so invisible, even to myself? I thought about David's photograph again, about the desperate look in his young eyes. Tomorrow, I decided, I would research learning differences on the computer at the local library. Not because Thomas Caldwell had asked me to, he had made it clear that my opinion was neither wanted nor valued, but because somewhere in this city was a little boy who needed an advocate, even if that advocate was just a woman who cleaned his father's apartment. I pulled the thin blanket up to my chin and stared at the ceiling. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to imagine a different life. What if I wasn't here tomorrow morning at 5:30? What if I didn't show up with the Ethiopian coffee and the fresh orchids? What if Margaret Rose Thompson, the invisible woman, simply disappeared? The thought was terrifying and thrilling in equal measure. But as sleep finally claimed me, I held onto it like a small flame in the darkness, a possibility that felt both impossible and inevitable. The next morning brought an unexpected disruption to our carefully orchestrated routine. Mrs. Victoria Caldwell had returned early from her business trip to Los Angeles, where she'd been meeting with interior designers about their new property in the Hamptons. The investment in cryptocurrency had paid off handsomely, and they were expanding their real estate portfolio with the kind of casual confidence that comes from having more money than you know how to spend. I heard her heels clicking across the marble entryway before 7 in the morning, her voice sharp with irritation as she spoke to someone on the phone about delayed deliveries and incompetent contractors. Victoria Caldwell was a woman who measured her worth in the perfection of her surroundings, and any deviation from her vision felt like a personal attack. "Margaret," she called, her voice echoing through the apartment. "Margaret, where are you?" I emerged from the kitchen where I'd been preparing Mr. Caldwell's breakfast, my hands still damp from washing the expensive crystal glasses they'd left scattered around the living room the night before. Victoria stood in the center of the room like a storm system, her blonde hair perfectly styled despite the early flight, her designer luggage abandoned by the elevator. "The apartment is a disaster," she announced, gesturing vaguely at surroundings that looked immaculate to any reasonable person. "I can see dust on the picture frames, and someone left water spots on the bathroom fixtures. I've told you a dozen times that attention to detail is what separates acceptable service from exceptional service." I nodded. swallowing the words that wanted to rise in my throat. The apartment was spotless. I'd spent 3 hours the previous evening ensuring every surface met their impossible standards. But Victoria Caldwell's definition of perfection shifted like fog, always just beyond reach, always requiring more effort and apology. "Of course, Mrs. Caldwell, I'll take care of everything right away." She studied me with those cold blue eyes that David had inherited, searching for signs of resistance or resentment. Finding none, I'd learned to school my expression years ago. She softened slightly. "I know you work hard, Margaret. It's just that we have very high standards, and maintaining this lifestyle requires everyone to be at their best." She paused, her voice taking on that patronizing tone I'd come to dread. "You're lucky to be part of such a successful household. The experience you're gaining here, the connections you're making, these are opportunities most people in your position never get." Lucky. The word sat in my stomach like a stone. Lucky to work 70 hours a week for wages that barely covered my basic expenses. Lucky to miss my own family's milestones to attend to their social obligations. Lucky to swallow my pride and my intelligence and my decades of life experience so they could feel important. "I understand, Mrs. Caldwell. I'll make sure everything meets your expectations." The morning passed in a blur of re-cleaning already clean surfaces, polishing fixtures that had been polished the day before, and listening to Victoria's commentary on various domestic failures that existed primarily in her imagination. By noon, my back ached from bending over bathtubs, and my hands were raw from the harsh chemicals she insisted I use on the marble countertops. It was while I was reorganizing the walk-in closet, a weekly ritual that Victoria claimed was necessary, but which seemed designed primarily to remind me of the vast gulf between our circumstances, that I overheard a phone conversation that would change everything. Victoria was speaking to her sister, Caroline, who lived in a similar penthouse across town. The conversation drifted through the open bedroom door, the kind of casual cruelty that wealthy women often mistake for honesty. "No, David won't be coming home for Christmas break this year," Victoria was saying, her voice carrying that brittle cheerfulness she used when discussing difficult subjects. "The school recommended he stay for additional tutoring. Apparently, he's been struggling with some academic challenges." There was a pause, and I could imagine Caroline's response on the other end of the line. "Oh, you know how these elite schools are," Victoria continued. "They have such high standards. Thomas thinks it's just a matter of applying the right pressure, finding the right incentives. We've already increased his allowance and promised him that new gaming system if his grades improve." Another pause, longer this time. "Learning disability?" Victoria's laugh was sharp, defensive. "Caroline, please. David is incredibly intelligent. His IQ tests prove that. He's just unmotivated. Lazy, frankly. All this talk about different learning styles and accommodations, it's just an excuse for teachers who don't know how to challenge bright children." I stopped organizing the designer handbags and listened more intently, my heart breaking for a little boy I'd never met who was trapped in his parents' need for perfection. The school psychologist suggested some kind of evaluation, but honestly, we don't want that kind of thing on his permanent record. Imagine if it affected his chances for Harvard or Yale. Thomas has already made significant donations to both institutions, and we can't have David's applications compromised by some label that suggests he's deficient. The conversation continued, but I'd heard enough. David Caldwell, that beautiful little boy with the desperate eyes, was struggling with the same challenges my grandson had faced. But where my family had rallied around our child, seeking help and support and understanding, the Caldwells were sacrificing their son's well-being to protect their image. I thought about my grandson, Marcus, now thriving in middle school with the support of teachers who understood his dyslexia. I thought about the pain and confusion he'd endured before we got him proper help, and how that early intervention had transformed his entire relationship with learning. David Caldwell had access to resources my family could never afford, but he was being denied the one thing that mattered most: parents who could see him as he was rather than as they needed him to be. That afternoon, while Victoria napped and Thomas worked in his office, I found myself standing in front of David's bedroom. The Caldwells had maintained a room for him despite his boarding school arrangement, a shrine to the child they wished he was rather than the child he actually was. The walls were covered with academic achievement awards, sports trophies, and photographs of David at various elite institutions. But looking more closely, I could see the strain in every image, the forced smiles and tense shoulders of a child performing success rather than experiencing it. On his desk sat a stack of schoolwork that had been sent home, assignments covered in red corrections and frustrated marks. I glanced at the door to make sure I was alone, then carefully examined one of the papers. David's handwriting was cramped and irregular, letters reversed and words misspelled in ways that I recognized immediately. This wasn't laziness or lack of intelligence. This was the clear signature of a learning difference that was being ignored and misunderstood. My hands shook as I set the paper back exactly where I'd found it. In that moment, I truly understood the weight of knowledge without power, the crushing responsibility of seeing a problem you cannot solve because the people who could solve it refuse to see it. The rest of the week passed in a strange suspension of normalcy. I performed my duties with mechanical efficiency, while my mind churned with thoughts of David and my own family and the choices that had brought me to this gilded cage. The Caldwells continued their routine of casual condescension and thoughtless demands, unaware that something fundamental had shifted in their invisible employee. On Friday evening, as I prepared to leave for the weekend, Thomas Caldwell emerged from his office with something unusual in his expression. He'd been on the phone with David's headmaster, and the conversation hadn't gone well. "Margaret," he said, his voice tight with controlled frustration, "I need you to work this weekend. Victoria is hosting a fundraiser on Sunday for the Metropolitan Museum, and we need everything to be perfect." It wasn't a request, it was an assumption. In 7 years, I'd never refused weekend work, never prioritized my own plans over their social obligations. But this Friday was different. My granddaughter, Emma, had a dance recital on Saturday afternoon, and my daughter, Sarah, had called 3 times begging me to be there. "Mr. Caldwell," I said carefully, "I'd already made plans to visit my family this weekend. My granddaughter has a performance, and I haven't seen them in over 2 months. His eyebrows rose slightly, as if I'd spoken in a foreign language. "Your family? Margaret, this fundraiser is incredibly important. We're expecting major donors, potential investors. The apartment needs to be absolutely spotless, and Victoria will need help with the catering preparations." "I understand the event is important," I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. "But this is the first time in months that I've had plans with my own family. Surely the apartment can go one day without—" "Without what?" Thomas interrupted, his voice hardening. "Without the level of care we pay you to provide? Margaret, I think you're forgetting your position here. We've been very generous with you over the years, very understanding about your personal issues. But this is your job, and our needs come first." The words hit me like ice water. Personal issues, as if my daughter's life, my granddaughter's milestones, my own need for rest and connection were merely inconveniences to be tolerated when they didn't interfere with the Caldwells' priorities. I thought about Emma's face when I'd promised to be at her recital. I thought about Sarah's disappointment every time I'd chosen the Caldwells' needs over our family. I thought about 7 years of swallowed pride and deferred dreams and the slow erosion of my own sense of worth. "I'll work on Sunday for the fundraiser," I said finally, "but Saturday is my day with my family." Thomas Caldwell stared at me as if I'd slapped him. In 7 years, I'd never drawn a line, never insisted on anything for myself. The dynamic between us had been so firmly established that my mild assertion felt like a revolution. "We'll discuss this on Monday," he said coldly. "Have a good weekend, Margaret." But his tone suggested that Monday's discussion wouldn't go well for me. As I gathered my coat and purse, I felt the first stirrings of something that had been dormant for too long. Not just anger, but a recognition of my own power. The power to say no, the power to choose, the power to disappear from their lives as completely as they'd made me disappear from my own. That Saturday, I sat in a middle school auditorium in Philadelphia, watching my granddaughter Emma twirl across the stage in a cloud of pink tulle. She wasn't the most talented dancer in the group, and her costume was clearly not as expensive as some of the others. But her face glowed with pure joy as she moved to the music. After the performance, she ran to me with arms wide, her face flushed with excitement. "Grandma, did you see me? Did you see my pirouettes?" I hugged her tight, breathing in the scent of hairspray and childhood happiness. "You were absolutely beautiful, sweetheart. I saw every single step." Sarah stood beside us, her eyes bright with tears. "Mom, thank you for being here. It means everything to Emma. It means everything to me." We went for ice cream afterward, just the three of us sitting in a small parlor that was nothing like the elegant restaurants the Caldwells frequented. Emma chattered about her dance class and her friends and her upcoming school play, and I listened with the kind of attention I'd been giving to other people's priorities for far too long. "Grandma," Emma said suddenly. Chocolate ice cream smeared across her chin. "Why don't you live closer to us? Samantha's grandma picks her up from school sometimes and helps with her science projects." The question cut through me like a blade. How could I explain that I'd been so busy caring for strangers that I'd forgotten how to care for my own family? How could I tell this beautiful child that I'd spent 7 years polishing someone else's life while mine gathered dust? "Maybe I will live closer someday," I heard myself say. "Would you like that?" Emma nodded vigorously, and Sarah looked at me with surprised hope. In that moment, sitting in a simple ice cream parlor with my daughter and granddaughter, I felt more valued and appreciated than I had in years of expensive gifts and cold acknowledgments from the Caldwells. Sunday's fundraiser passed in a blur of elaborate preparations and social performance. The Caldwell apartment was transformed into a showcase of wealth and cultural sophistication, filled with New York's elite discussing their latest acquisitions and charitable endeavors. I moved through the crowd like a ghost, refilling glasses and clearing plates, invisible despite being essential. I watched Victoria Caldwell hold court near the Steinway piano, discussing her latest art purchases and the challenges of maintaining multiple homes. She wore a dress that cost more than I made in 6 months, her jewelry sparkling under the carefully arranged lighting. To the assembled guests, she was the epitome of success and refinement. But I knew better. I knew about the phone calls to boarding schools and the desperate attempts to hide her son's struggles. I knew about the casual cruelty she directed at service staff and the way she measured her worth through the perfection of her surroundings. I knew that beneath the polished exterior lay the same insecurities and fears that plagued everyone else, only wrapped in designer clothes and defended with inherited privilege. Near the end of the evening, as I was cleaning up abandoned champagne glasses, I overheard a conversation that made my blood run cold. Thomas Caldwell was speaking to a potential business partner about his investment strategies, his voice carrying that casual arrogance that came with inherited wealth. "The key to managing household staff," he was saying, "is to remember that they're easily replaceable. Domestic workers, especially women of a certain age, they don't have many options. They know they're lucky to have steady employment, so they don't make unreasonable demands." His conversation partner, a younger man with an expensive watch, nodded thoughtfully. "What about raises, benefits, that sort of thing?" Thomas laughed, the sound sharp and dismissive. "Please, these people don't understand complex financial planning. They live paycheck to paycheck by choice, not circumstance. A small Christmas bonus and some hand-me-down clothes from my wife, and they feel appreciated. It's quite cost-effective, actually. I stood frozen behind the marble column, a tray of dirty glasses in my hands, listening to my 7 years of service reduced to a cost-benefit analysis. In that moment, I understood with perfect clarity that I had never been a person in this household. I had been a convenience, easily used and easily discarded. The following Monday morning, I arrived at the usual time, but with an entirely different mindset. My movements through the apartment were mechanical, automatic, while my mind worked through possibilities and calculations. I thought about my modest savings account, my few possessions, the life I'd put on hold for 7 years. Thomas Caldwell emerged from his office around 9, his expression stern with anticipated confrontation. "Margaret, we need to discuss Friday's conversation. Your attitude has been unacceptable." I set down my cleaning supplies and faced him directly, something I'd rarely done in all our years together. "Mr. Caldwell, I've been thinking about our arrangement." He blinked, clearly surprised by my calm tone. "Our arrangement?" "Yes. 7 years of my life, Mr. Caldwell. 7 years of 60-hour work weeks, missed holidays with my family, canceled plans, delayed payments. 7 years of being treated like furniture that occasionally needs feeding." His face darkened. "Margaret, you're being dramatic. We've been generous employers. We've provided you with steady work, health insurance, even given you advances when you needed money for family emergencies." "Generous?" The word came out sharper than I intended. "Mr. Caldwell, you pay me below market rate for a job that requires the skills of 3 different people. Your wife speaks to me like I'm a child, and you've both made it clear that my personal life is an inconvenience to be managed rather than a priority to be respected." He straightened to his full height, his posture radiating the kind of authority that came from never having it questioned. "I think you're forgetting yourself, Margaret. If you're unhappy with your position here, there are thousands of women who would be grateful for this opportunity. Then perhaps you should hire one of them." The words hung in the air between us, shocking in their finality. Thomas Caldwell's face went through several expressions: surprise, anger, calculation, before settling into cold dismissal. "Very well. Consider this your 2 weeks' notice. We'll pay you through the end of the month, and I'll provide a reference that acknowledges your years of service." "That won't be necessary," I replied, already untying my apron. "I resign immediately. Your next employee should know something you might not have mentioned. Your son David has dyslexia, and ignoring it won't make it go away. That beautiful, intelligent boy needs help, not pressure. He needs parents who see him as he is, not as they wish he were." Thomas Caldwell's face went white. "You have no right to comment on my family or my son. You're just the help." I folded my apron carefully and placed it on the kitchen counter. "No, Mr. Caldwell, I was never just the help. I was a woman with 40 years of life experience, a mother who raised a daughter, a grandmother who's helped a child overcome learning challenges. I was a person with insights and wisdom and value that went far beyond my ability to make your coffee and dust your furniture. I gathered my few personal belongings, a sweater Sarah had given me, a photograph of Emma, the cheap purse that held my entire life outside these walls. I hope your son gets the help he needs, and I hope someday you realize that the people who serve you are human beings with their own dreams and dignity." As I walked toward the service elevator, Thomas Caldwell called after me, his voice tight with something that might have been panic. "Margaret, wait. Let's not be hasty. Perhaps we can discuss a raise, some additional benefits." But I didn't turn around. The elevator doors opened, and I stepped inside, feeling lighter than I had in 7 years. As the car descended toward the ground floor, I caught my reflection in the polished doors. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I looked like someone who mattered. The next few days passed in a strange suspension of freedom and terror. I stayed with my sister in Queens, sleeping on her couch and trying to figure out what came next. At 58, with 7 years of employment that could hardly be called a career, my options felt limited and frightening. But something unexpected happened during those uncertain days. Word spread through the domestic worker network, an invisible web of women who cleaned and cooked and cared for New York's wealthy families, about what I'd done. The story grew in the telling, but at its core was something that resonated with women who'd spent years swallowing their pride and their voices. Maria, who worked for a family in Tribeca, called to tell me about a position with a kind elderly gentleman who needed help organizing his late wife's belongings. "He's not wealthy like the Caldwells," she said, "but he's decent. He says please and thank you, and he pays on time." Carmen, who cleaned for a young family on the Upper West Side, mentioned that her employers were looking for someone to help with childcare. They both work crazy hours, but they understand about family. The mother asked me to find someone who could love their children, not just watch them. Slowly, I began to understand that my years with the Caldwells, painful as they'd been, had taught me valuable skills. Not just cleaning and organizing, but the ability to anticipate needs, to work independently to manage complex household systems. I'd learned to cater elaborate dinners, to coordinate with service providers, to maintain expensive furnishings and equipment. More importantly, I'd learned to see families, really see them, to notice when a child was struggling, when a marriage was strained, when someone needed kindness rather than criticism. The Caldwells had never valued this insight, but other families might. 3 weeks after leaving the penthouse, I found work with Eleanor Patterson, an 80-year-old widow living in a brownstone on the Upper West Side. Eleanor's grown children had hired me to help her maintain her independence while ensuring she received proper care and companionship. The contrast to my previous position was immediate and striking. Eleanor greeted me at the door on my first day, shaking my hand and inviting me to sit with her for tea while we discussed expectations and boundaries. She asked about my family, listened to stories about Emma's dance recitals, and expressed genuine interest in my life beyond her employment. "I don't need a servant," Eleanor explained, her voice still strong despite her years. "I need a companion, someone who can help me manage this house without taking over my life. I want to remain Eleanor Patterson, not become someone's charity case." Working for Eleanor was like stepping into sunlight after years in shadow. She valued my opinions, respected my time, and treated me as an equal partner in maintaining her household and her independence. When I mentioned David Caldwell's learning challenges during one of our afternoon conversations, Eleanor listened with the kind of attention the Caldwells had never afforded my insights. "You know," Eleanor said thoughtfully, "my late husband struggled with dyslexia his entire life. Back then, they called children like him lazy or stupid. It nearly destroyed his self-confidence until a teacher in college recognized his actual intelligence. He went on to become a successful architect, but he never forgot how it felt to be misunderstood." She paused, sipping her tea from delicate china that was beautiful, but not ostentatious. "Perhaps you should write to that boy, not to his parents, but to him directly. Sometimes children need to know that someone sees their worth, even when the people closest to them cannot." The idea seemed impossible at first. What right did I have to contact David Caldwell? But as days passed, Eleanor's suggestion grew in my mind like a seed finding soil. I thought about my grandson, Marcus, about how much a single caring adult had meant during his difficult early years. I thought about David's desperate eyes in that photograph, about the isolation he must feel in that expensive boarding school, where his struggles were seen as failures rather than challenges to overcome. After much internal debate, I crafted a careful letter to David. I didn't criticize his parents or reveal details of my time in their home. Instead, I told him about Marcus, about the brilliant, creative, successful young man he'd become once he received proper support for his dyslexia. I told David that different brains work in different ways, that some of the most innovative and successful people in history had learned differently. Most importantly, I told him that his worth as a person had nothing to do with his ability to read the way others expected him to read. I included some resources about young people with dyslexia who'd gone on to achieve remarkable things, and I gave him my sister's address in case he ever needed someone to listen. I never expected a response, so when a letter arrived 3 weeks later, addressed in careful, deliberate handwriting, my hands shook as I opened it. David's letter was brief but piercing in its honesty. "Thank you for seeing me when my parents couldn't. I've been so tired of feeling stupid. Your stories about Marcus give me hope that maybe I'm not broken." Reading those words, I understood something profound about the reversal of power that had occurred in my life. As the Caldwell's employee, I'd been invisible, voiceless, without agency or influence. But as a free woman with accumulated wisdom and hard-earned insights, I could offer something far more valuable than perfect housekeeping. I could offer understanding and hope to a child who desperately needed both. 6 months after leaving the penthouse, I received an unexpected phone call from Victoria Caldwell. Her voice was strained, lacking its usual imperious confidence. "Margaret, I need to speak with you. It's about David." We met at a small cafe in Midtown, neutral territory where neither of us held advantage. Victoria looked older, her perfect composure cracked by months of struggle with her son's academic difficulties. The expensive clothing and flawless makeup remained, but underneath I could see the fear and confusion of a mother facing challenges that money couldn't solve. "The school is threatening to expel David," she said without preamble. "His grades have gotten worse and he's been acting out, fighting with other students, refusing to participate in class. The headmaster says he needs intensive intervention that they're not equipped to provide." I sipped my coffee and waited for her to continue, remembering Eleanor's advice about the power of silence in difficult conversations. "Thomas found your letter to David. We had it analyzed by a handwriting expert to make sure you weren't trying to manipulate our son somehow." Victoria's cheeks flushed slightly at this admission. "But David's response to your letter was so positive, so different from anything we'd seen in months. He started talking about this Marcus boy you mentioned, asking questions about dyslexia." She leaned forward. Her designer handbag clutched tightly in her manicured hands. "Margaret, I need to ask you, do you really think David has a learning disability? And if he does, what should we do about it?" The question hung between us, loaded with 7 years of dismissed wisdom and ignored insights. I thought about all the times I'd tried to share observations about their family life, only to be reminded of my place as an employee rather than a person with valid perspectives. "Mrs. Caldwell," I said carefully, "I'm not qualified to diagnose learning differences, but I spent years watching your son struggle with tasks that should have been easier for a child of his intelligence. I saw the frustration and self-doubt in his eyes, the same look my grandson had before we got him help." Victoria's composure finally cracked, tears spilling down her cheeks despite her obvious efforts to maintain control. I was so afraid that admitting David had problems would somehow diminish him, would limit his opportunities. Thomas kept saying that accepting a diagnosis would be giving up on our son's potential. "The opposite is true," I replied gently. "Understanding how David's brain works is the first step toward helping him reach his actual potential. A dyslexia diagnosis isn't a limitation, it's a roadmap to success." Over the next hour, Victoria asked questions she should have asked years earlier. She wanted to know about Marcus's journey, about the interventions that had helped him, about the schools and therapists who specialized in learning differences. For the first time in our relationship, she listened to me not as an employee providing information, but as one mother seeking guidance from another. When we parted, Victoria shook my hand with genuine gratitude. "Margaret, I owe you an apology. For years, you tried to share insights about our family, and we treated your observations as presumptuous. I realize now that you saw things we were too proud to acknowledge." 3 months later, I received another update. David had been enrolled in a specialized school in Manhattan that focused on bright children with learning differences. His grades had improved dramatically, but more importantly, his confidence had returned. Victoria's letter included a photograph of David smiling, really smiling, for the first time since I'd known the family. The transformation in my own life continued to unfold in unexpected ways. Eleanor's children had recommended me to several of their friends, and I found myself building a small network of elderly clients who valued companionship as much as practical assistance. Unlike my years with the Caldwells, these relationships were built on mutual respect and clear boundaries. More surprisingly, I discovered that my experience with families like the Caldwells had given me unusual insight into the dynamics of wealth and privilege. Several clients asked for my opinions on family matters, recognizing that my years of observing their world from the inside had provided me with perspectives they couldn't get from their usual advisors. Eleanor encouraged me to consider writing about my experiences, to give voice to the army of domestic workers whose observations and insights were routinely dismissed. "You've seen how the wealthy live when they think no one important is watching," she said one afternoon. "Those stories matter, Margaret. They reveal truths about power and humanity that need to be told." The idea terrified and exhilarated me in equal measure. For years, my voice had been silenced by economic necessity and social expectations. The thought of speaking publicly about the Caldwells and families like them felt both risky and essential. I started small, writing short pieces for a local community newsletter about the challenges facing domestic workers in New York City. The response was immediate and surprising. Women reached out to share their own stories of invisible labor and emotional exploitation. Many were immigrants who faced additional barriers of language and documentation status, but the core experiences were remarkably similar. A journalist from the New York Times read one of my pieces and contacted me for an interview about the hidden world of domestic work in Manhattan's luxury buildings. The resulting article, published on a Sunday in the lifestyle section, generated hundreds of responses from readers who recognized elements of their own family dynamics in my observations. The most meaningful response came from an unexpected source. Thomas Caldwell left a message on Eleanor's answering machine, asking me to call him back. When I finally returned his call, his voice was subdued, lacking the cold authority I remembered from our years together. "Margaret, I read your article in the Times. I wanted to call and, well, to apologize, and to thank you." He paused, and I could hear something that might have been shame in the silence. "David is thriving at his new school. The transformation has been remarkable. I realize now that you were trying to help us for years, and we were too arrogant to listen." He went on to explain that David's success had forced him and Victoria to examine other aspects of their relationships, particularly with the people who served their household. They'd increased wages for their remaining staff, instituted regular performance reviews that included employee feedback, and begun treating domestic workers as skilled professionals rather than interchangeable servants. "I can't undo the ways we treated you," Thomas said finally, "but I want you to know that your courage in speaking up changed our family. David is happy for the first time in years, and Victoria and I are learning to be better parents and employers." The apology meant more than I'd expected it would, not because it erased 7 years of casual disrespect and emotional exploitation, but because it acknowledged that my insights and observations had carried value all along. The Caldwells had finally recognized me as a person whose thoughts and feelings mattered, even if that recognition came too late to repair our relationship. A year after leaving the penthouse, I found myself in a position I'd never imagined possible. Eleanor's referrals had led to consulting work with families who wanted to improve their relationships with household staff. Wealthy New Yorkers, motivated by guilt, genuine concern, or simple pragmatism, began paying me to help them understand the perspectives and needs of their domestic employees. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was now earning more money in a few hours of consultation than I'd made in weeks of actual housework, but the real satisfaction came from knowing that my experiences, painful as they'd been, were helping other women avoid the kind of emotional exploitation I'd endured. My relationship with my own family deepened as I rebuilt the connections that 7 years of misplaced priorities had damaged. Sarah and I talked every few days, and I stayed with her family every other weekend, present for Emma's dance recitals, school plays, and ordinary daily moments that I'd missed for too long. Emma, now 7, had grown comfortable with my presence in her life. She shared her dreams and worries with the kind of open trust I'd forgotten could exist between family members. When she struggled with reading in 1st grade, I was there to provide the patient support and encouragement that helped her work through temporary difficulties. "Grandma Margaret," she said one evening as I helped her practice sight words, "my teacher says everyone's brain works differently and that's what makes people special. Is that true?" I thought of David Caldwell, now thriving at his specialized school, and of Marcus, who'd gone on to excel in high school despite his early struggles with dyslexia. I thought of all the children whose potential had been dismissed or overlooked because they learned differently than expected. It's absolutely true, sweetheart. The most interesting and creative people are often the ones who see the world in their own special way. Emma smiled and returned to her practice, confident in her ability to master whatever challenges came her way. Watching her, I felt the deep satisfaction of finally being present for the moments that mattered most. 2 years after leaving the Caldwells, I received an invitation that stunned me completely. David Caldwell, now 13 and thriving at his specialized school, was being honored at an academic awards ceremony. His parents had specifically requested that I attend as their guest, recognizing my role in his transformation. The ceremony was held at the school's Manhattan campus, a beautiful limestone building that radiated warmth and acceptance, rather than the cold prestige of David's previous institution. Students, parents, and teachers gathered in an auditorium decorated with artwork created by children whose brains worked in wonderfully diverse ways. When David took the stage to accept his award for improvement and perseverance, I saw a completely different child than the one in Thomas Caldwell's photograph. His shoulders were straight, his smile genuine, his eyes bright with confidence and curiosity. He spoke briefly about overcoming challenges and finding strength in difference, his voice clear and assured. Afterward, David approached me with his parents. He was taller now, his face beginning to show hints of the man he would become. But his eyes still held that spark of intelligence I'd recognized years earlier. "Mrs. Thompson," he said, extending his hand with adult formality, "thank you for seeing me when I couldn't see myself. Your letter changed my life." I shook his hand, my throat tight with emotion. "David, you changed your own life. I just helped you realize you had the strength to do it." Thomas and Victoria Caldwell stood beside their son, and I saw in their faces the same transformation that had occurred in David. They'd learned to see their child as he truly was, and in doing so, they'd discovered that he was far more remarkable than the perfect son they'd tried to create. The evening concluded with parents and students sharing stories about the journey from diagnosis to acceptance to celebration. I listened to families who'd traveled paths similar to David's, each finding their own way to embrace difference as strength rather than limitation. Driving home with Eleanor, who'd accompanied me to the ceremony, I reflected on the strange circuitous route that had led from that first painful conversation about David's photograph to this moment of triumph and reconciliation. The path had been marked by loss and anger, fear and determination, but it had ultimately led to something I'd never expected, the recognition of my own worth and wisdom. "You know," Eleanor said as we sat in evening traffic, "you've become quite an inspiration to people. The families you work with now speak about you with real respect and appreciation." I considered her words, thinking about the women I now counseled and advocated for, the domestic workers who'd found their voices through my example. The work I was doing felt more meaningful than anything I'd accomplished in my previous life, even though, or perhaps because, it had grown from such painful experience. My phone buzzed with a text message from Sarah. "Mom, Emma's teacher wants to nominate her for the creative writing contest. She wrote a story about her grandmother who helps families understand each other better. Wonder where she got that idea?" I smiled, recognizing in Emma's story the kind of legacy I'd never imagined creating. Not wealth or status or material achievement, but the simple, powerful example of a woman who'd found her voice and used it to help others find theirs. The following year brought opportunities that continued to surprise me. A publisher approached me about writing a book based on my New York Times article, and I found myself documenting not just my own experiences, but the stories of dozens of other domestic workers who'd found courage to demand dignity and respect in their professional relationships. The book, titled Invisible No More, A Domestic Worker's Journey to Recognition and Respect, became an unexpected success. It was featured in book clubs across the country, recommended by advocacy organizations, and praised by reviewers for its honest portrayal of class dynamics in contemporary America. More importantly, it sparked conversations about the treatment of domestic workers and the value of their contributions to the families they served. Several cities began considering legislation to protect household employees from wage theft and emotional abuse, citing testimonies like mine as evidence of widespread problems that required legal remedy. The success of the book led to speaking engagements at universities, advocacy organizations, and even corporate conferences, where executives sought to understand power dynamics in their own workplaces. I found myself comfortable on stages and podiums, my voice steady as I shared stories that had once felt too painful and personal to tell. During one particularly memorable presentation at Columbia University, a young woman in the audience raised her hand during the question period. "Ms. Thompson, what would you say to someone who feels trapped in a situation where their insights and observations aren't valued?" I thought about my years of silence in the Caldwell apartment, about all the times I'd swallowed important words to preserve my economic security. I'd say that your perspective has value, whether other people recognize it or not. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is trust your own judgment enough to walk away from people who refuse to see your worth. The audience applauded, but I was thinking about that young woman and the countless others who were struggling with similar challenges. After the presentation, she approached me with tears in her eyes, explaining that she was working as a nanny for a family that treated her exactly as the Caldwells had treated me. "I kept telling myself I was lucky to have the job," she said, "but listening to your story, I realize I'm not lucky. I'm being exploited." We talked for another hour about practical strategies for finding better employment and emotional techniques for maintaining dignity in difficult circumstances. When she left, she handed me a handwritten note. "Thank you for helping me remember that I'm a person, not just a service provider." These interactions became the most rewarding part of my new life, speaking for and with women who'd found themselves invisible in their professional relationships, helping them recognize their own power and worth. The work felt like a natural extension of everything I'd learned through pain and struggle, a way of transforming personal suffering into collective empowerment. 3 years after leaving the Caldwells, I received news that surprised me more than anything that had come before. David Caldwell had been accepted to Harvard University with a full scholarship, not despite his learning differences, but because of the unique perspective and resilience they'd helped him develop. Victoria called to share the news, her voice bright with pride and gratitude. "Margaret, I wanted you to be among the first to know. David's essay about overcoming learning challenges and finding strength in difference was what convinced the admissions committee. He wrote about you, about the letter you sent him when he felt most lost." I sat in my small apartment in Queens, the place I now called home rather than just where I slept, and marveled at the unexpected connections that had grown from that first painful conversation about David's photograph. A moment of recognition and courage had rippled outward, changing not just my life, but the lives of an entire family. That evening, I called Marcus, my grandson who'd started college the previous fall and was thriving in his engineering program. "You know," I told him, "I think I finally understand what your mother meant when she said that our struggles can become our strength if we let them." Marcus laughed, his voice warm with affection. "Grandma Margaret, you've been showing us that lesson for years. We just had to wait for the rest of the world to catch up." As I prepared for bed that night, I caught my reflection in the bathroom mirror and saw something that would have been impossible 5 years earlier. A woman who looked dignified, confident, and valuable. Not because of what I did for others, but because of who I'd become through the process of claiming my own worth. The changes in my life continued to unfold in ways both large and small. Eleanor's health had declined slightly, requiring more intensive care, and I'd become not just her employee, but her trusted confidant and advocate in navigating medical systems and family decisions. When her children visited from out of state, they consulted with me about their mother's needs and preferences, recognizing that I knew her daily rhythms and emotional needs better than anyone. My work with other families had evolved as well. Instead of simply providing domestic services, I'd become a bridge between different worlds, helping wealthy families understand the perspectives of their employees while advocating for workers who earn dignity through their labor. The consulting work paid well enough that I could be selective about my clients, working only with families who demonstrated genuine respect for their household staff. Most surprisingly, I'd begun teaching workshops for domestic workers through a community organization in Queens. Women from all over New York City came to learn about their legal rights, strategies for professional advancement, and techniques for maintaining emotional health in challenging work environments. These workshops became laboratories for sharing wisdom and building solidarity among women who'd often felt isolated in their professional struggles. We talked about wage theft and emotional abuse, but also about finding joy and pride in work that kept families functioning and homes beautiful. We discussed practical strategies like keeping detailed records of hours worked and duties performed, but also emotional strategies for maintaining self-respect in environments that didn't always value our contributions. One evening, as I was preparing materials for the next day's workshop, my phone rang with a call that brought my journey full circle in an unexpected way. The voice on the other end belonged to a young woman named Jessica, who worked for a wealthy family on the Upper East Side. "Ms. Thompson, I read your book and heard you speak at the community center last month. I'm in a situation very similar to what you experienced with the Caldwells, and I don't know what to do." Over the next hour, Jessica shared a story that was heartbreakingly familiar. 7 years working for a family who treated her like invisible furniture while depending on her for essential services. Canceled vacation days, delayed payments, casual cruelty disguised as constructive criticism. The gradual erosion of self-worth that came from being simultaneously essential and dismissible. "The worst part," Jessica said, her voice thick with emotion, "is that they have a 10-year-old son who clearly has ADHD, but they refuse to acknowledge it. They just keep punishing him for being unable to sit still or focus, calling him lazy and undisciplined. I want to help him, but I'm just the nanny. They don't want my input." Listening to Jessica's story, I felt the familiar anger that came with recognizing patterns of prideful ignorance and institutional blindness. But I also felt something new, the satisfaction of being able to offer concrete guidance born from experience and hard-won wisdom. "Jessica," I said carefully, "you have more power than you realize. Your observations about that child carry value whether his parents recognize it or not. The question is whether you're prepared to use your voice, even if it means risking your position." We talked through strategies for documenting behaviors, researching resources, and finding appropriate moments to share observations. I helped her craft a plan that balanced her genuine concern for the child with realistic assessments of the risks she faced in speaking up. "Remember," I told her as our conversation ended. "You're not just a nanny. You're a professional with years of experience observing child development and family dynamics. Your insights deserve respect, and if this family can't provide that, there are others who will." 6 months later, Jessica called with an update that vindicated both of our faith in the power of respectful advocacy. The family had initially dismissed her concerns about their son's attention difficulties, but when his academic problems worsened, they'd reluctantly agreed to have him evaluated. The diagnosis of ADHD had led to appropriate interventions and support, and the child was now thriving, both academically and emotionally. More importantly, Jessica's role in the family had evolved from invisible service provider to trusted advisor, whose observations about their children were valued and sought. "I keep thinking about what you told me," Jessica said, "about how we're not just employees, we're professionals with valuable skills and insights. That perspective changed everything for me." Conversations like this one reminded me daily of the ripple effects that could emerge from a single act of courage or recognition. My decision to speak up about David Caldwell's needs, painful and risky as it had been, had created waves that were still spreading outward years later, touching families and children I would never meet. As I approached my 4th year of freedom from the Caldwell apartment, I received an invitation that brought me face to face with how much had changed in my understanding of my own worth and capabilities. The New York Association of Professional Household Staff asked me to keynote their annual conference, addressing hundreds of domestic workers about dignity, advocacy, and professional development. Standing at the podium in a midtown hotel ballroom, looking out at faces that reflected my own journey from invisibility to recognition, I felt the full weight and privilege of having found my voice. These women, house managers and nannies and personal assistants and housekeepers, had built their lives around serving others while often sacrificing their own needs and dreams. For years, I began, I believed that my value lay in my ability to anticipate needs, solve problems, and remain invisible while other people lived their lives. I thought that good service meant never asserting my own perspective or advocating for my own interests. I paused, thinking about Margaret Thompson, the maid who had polished the Caldwell's marble floors every morning while her own life gathered dust. But I eventually learned that the most valuable service we can provide to the families we work for and to ourselves is the service of honest, thoughtful, professional engagement. We see these families in ways that no one else does. We understand their dynamics, their challenges, their blind spots. That knowledge is valuable, and it deserves to be shared respectfully and heard seriously. The applause that followed felt different from the polite acknowledgement I'd received at other speaking events. This was recognition from peers who understood the daily challenges of invisible labor, the emotional toll of swallowed observations, the complex balance between professional service and personal dignity. After the keynote, I was surrounded by women eager to share their own stories and seek advice about situations they were navigating. A house manager from Brooklyn described her struggle to advocate for safer working conditions in a household with toxic cleaning chemicals. A nanny from the Bronx worried about the children in her care who were clearly being affected by their parents' destructive marriage, but felt powerless to intervene. Each conversation reminded me of the vast network of women who kept wealthy families functioning while their own contributions remained largely unacknowledged and undercompensated. But I also saw, in the questions they asked and the strategies they shared with each other, a growing sense of professional identity and collective power. The most moving moment of the conference came during a panel discussion about career advancement and professional development. A young woman in the audience raised her hand and said, "Ms. Thompson, your story gives me hope that our work can lead somewhere meaningful. But I'm wondering, do you ever regret the years you spent with the Caldwell family? Do you wish you'd left sooner?" The question cut to the heart of feelings I'd wrestled with for years. The anger and resentment at time lost, opportunities missed, dignity compromised. But as I considered my answer, I realized that even those painful years had carried value I was only beginning to understand. I don't regret those years, I said finally, because they taught me things I couldn't have learned any other way. They showed me the difference between service and servility, between accommodation and self-erasure. They helped me understand the power dynamics that exist in every household, and they gave me the credibility to speak about these issues in ways that resonate with both employees and employers. I looked directly at the young woman who'd asked the question. More importantly, those years helped me recognize my own strength and resilience. If I could maintain my sense of self while being treated as invisible for 7 years, I could certainly step forward and claim visibility when the opportunity arose. The conference concluded with a ceremony honoring long-serving domestic workers whose contributions had gone largely unrecognized throughout their careers. Women in their 70s and 80s, many of them immigrants who'd spent decades caring for families while sacrificing time with their own, received standing ovations from their younger colleagues. Watching these ceremonies, I felt both grief for all the women whose wisdom had never been celebrated and hope for the younger generation who were building professional identities grounded in dignity and mutual respect. The invisibility that had characterized domestic work for so long was slowly giving way to recognition, advocacy, and collective action. The following month brought news that crystallized everything I'd learned about the unexpected power of patient persistence and moral courage. David Caldwell, now a sophomore at Harvard, had written an editorial for the university newspaper about learning differences and the importance of early intervention. The piece, titled "The Gift of Being Seen," described his journey from academic failure to success, crediting not just his specialized school and supportive teachers, but also a family employee who'd had the courage to speak truthfully about his needs when his parents were too proud to recognize them. "Margaret Thompson was just the maid in our apartment," David wrote, "but she saw me more clearly than anyone else in my life. Her willingness to speak up about my struggles, to share her knowledge about learning differences, to treat me as a person worth helping, that changed everything for me and my family." The editorial went on to discuss the perspectives that domestic workers bring to wealthy households, arguing that their insights were often dismissed precisely because they came from people who were viewed as socially and economically inferior. David called on his fellow Harvard students to examine their own relationships with service workers and to recognize the humanity and wisdom of people they might otherwise overlook. Reading David's words, I felt a satisfaction that was deeper and more lasting than any paycheck or recognition I'd received. This young man, who'd been struggling with shame and confusion when I first saw his photograph, had grown into someone who understood the value of every person's perspective and contribution. His editorial sparked campus-wide discussions about class privilege and the treatment of service workers. The Harvard administration announced new initiatives to improve working conditions and compensation for dining hall staff, custodial workers, and other employees whose labor kept the university functioning. More personally, David's public acknowledgement of my role in his transformation opened doors I'd never imagined. Universities began inviting me to speak about the psychology of household dynamics and the unique perspectives of domestic workers. Researchers studying child development and family systems sought my insights about observations that might be missed by families too close to their own situations. A professor at Columbia University's Teachers College approached me about developing a training program for people who work with wealthy families, particularly around issues of child advocacy and professional boundary setting. The idea excited me. The possibility of formalizing and sharing the knowledge I'd gained through experience, of creating systems that could protect both workers and the families they served. As I celebrated my 5th anniversary of freedom from the Caldwell apartment, I reflected on the woman I'd been when I first walked through their service entrance and the woman I'd become through the process of claiming my own voice and worth. The transformation hadn't been easy or straightforward. There had been months of financial uncertainty, periods of self-doubt, moments when I'd wondered if I'd been foolish to leave the security of steady employment. But security built on self-erasure wasn't really security at all. It was a kind of emotional and spiritual prison that had kept me from growing, from contributing my full gifts to the world, from being present for my own family's important moments. Now, at 63, I woke each morning with a sense of purpose and possibility that had been absent during those years of invisible service. My work was varied and meaningful. Some days spent caring for Eleanor, whose health continued to decline slowly, but whose appreciation for companionship never wavered. Other days devoted to consulting, teaching, or writing about the experiences that had shaped my understanding of dignity and worth. Most importantly, I was fully present in my relationships with Sarah and Emma and the rest of my family. I attended every recital, every school play, every important moment that I'd missed during my years of misplaced priorities. Emma, now 11, had grown up with a grandmother who was engaged and available, and our relationship was built on the kind of mutual respect and genuine affection that I'd thought was reserved for other families. One evening, as Emma and I worked together on a school project about remarkable women in history, she looked up from her research and asked, "Grandma Margaret, do you think you're a remarkable woman?" The question surprised me. For most of my life, I'd thought of remarkable women as people who achieved great things in public spheres, scientists and artists and leaders who changed the world through their exceptional talents and opportunities. I think, I said carefully, that I'm a woman who learned to recognize her own worth and use her voice to help others. Whether that makes me remarkable is for other people to decide. Emma considered this answer seriously. "I think you're remarkable because you stood up for David even when his parents weren't ready to listen, and because you help other women find their voices too. That seems pretty remarkable to me." From the mouth of an 11-year-old came wisdom that put my own journey into perfect perspective. I had become remarkable not through extraordinary talent or unprecedented success, but through the simple, revolutionary act of refusing to remain invisible when I had something important to contribute. 6 months later, I received a phone call that brought my story full circle in the most unexpected and meaningful way possible. Victoria Caldwell's voice was different, warmer, more uncertain than the imperious tone I remembered from our years together. "Margaret, I hope you won't mind my calling. David is graduating from Harvard next month, and he specifically asked us to invite you to the ceremony. He says you were instrumental in his success, and he wants you to be there to celebrate with our family." The invitation moved me deeply, not just because it represented recognition of my role in David's transformation, but because it demonstrated how much the entire Caldwell family had grown in their understanding of value and contribution. They were acknowledging publicly that their former maid had played a crucial role in their son's success, an admission that would have been unthinkable during my years of service in their household. Harvard's graduation ceremony was everything I'd imagined. Pomp and tradition and the excited energy of young people launching into their futures. But for me, the most meaningful moment came when David Caldwell crossed the stage to receive his degree, and I saw in his confident stride and brilliant smile the fulfillment of potential that had once seemed so threatened by misunderstanding and pride. After the ceremony, David sought me out among the crowds of celebrating families. He was taller than I remembered, his face mature now, but still carrying those expressive eyes that had first captured my attention in his father's photograph. "Mrs. Thompson," he said, embracing me with genuine warmth, "thank you for being here. Thank you for everything you did for me when I needed it most." We talked for several minutes about his plans, graduate school in educational psychology, with a focus on learning differences and advocacy for children who learn differently. His career goals had been shaped directly by his own experiences and by the example of courage I'd provided in speaking up for his needs. "You know," David said as our conversation was ending, "I've learned something important about courage from watching your journey. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is tell the truth when no one wants to hear it, especially when that truth comes from someone the world expects to stay silent." Thomas and Victoria Caldwell approached us then, their faces carrying expressions I'd never seen during my years in their employ: humility, gratitude, and genuine respect. Victoria shook my hand warmly, her eyes bright with tears. "Margaret, I need you to know that David's success is partly your success too. Your courage in speaking up about his needs. Your refusal to let us ignore his struggles. That changed everything for our family. We've become better parents because of your example." Thomas nodded, his voice thick with emotion. "We treated you badly, Margaret. We were so focused on maintaining our image of perfection that we couldn't see the wisdom you were offering. I'm grateful that you found the strength to leave us, because it forced us to confront truths we'd been avoiding." The apologies meant more than I'd expected. Not because I needed their validation, I'd learned to value myself independent of their recognition, but because they represented genuine growth and understanding that could benefit other families and employees. As I drove home from Cambridge that evening, I reflected on the strange and wonderful trajectory that had brought me from invisible service to visible advocacy. The pain of those early years at the Caldwell apartment had been real and lasting, but it had also been the crucible that forged my understanding of dignity, worth, and the power of speaking truth, regardless of the personal cost. My phone rang as I was crossing into New York, Sarah's number lighting up the dashboard. "Mom, how was the graduation? I can't wait to hear about it." "It was beautiful, sweetheart, really beautiful. But the best part was realizing how far we've all come. David, his family, and me too." We talked for the rest of the drive, Sarah listening as I processed the emotions of the day and the connections between past pain and present purpose. When I finally reached home, Emma was waiting on the front steps with a handmade card congratulating me on what she called helping David graduate from college. Inside the card, she'd written, "Thank you, Grandma Margaret, for teaching me that everyone's voice matters, especially when they're trying to help someone else." Reading those words, I understood that the most important legacy of my journey wasn't the book I'd written, or the speeches I'd given, or even the direct impact I'd had on David Caldwell's life. It was the example I'd provided for the next generation, showing Emma and other young women that their perspectives have value, that their voices deserve to be heard, that their dignity is non-negotiable regardless of their economic circumstances or social position. That night, I sat in my small apartment looking out at the lights of Queens, thinking about all the women in households across the city who were facing choices similar to the ones I'd faced in the Caldwell apartment. Some would find the courage to speak up, to advocate for themselves and the families they served. Others would remain silent, trapped by fear or economic necessity, or the internalized belief that their insights didn't matter. My role now was to be a bridge for those women, to show them that invisibility was a choice rather than an inevitable condition, to demonstrate that service and dignity could coexist when relationships were built on mutual respect rather than economic desperation. The transformation from Margaret the Invisible Maid to Margaret the Advocate and author had been neither quick nor easy. It had required leaving behind the security of steady employment, facing the uncertainty of an unknown future, and finding the courage to value my own perspectives enough to share them publicly. But sitting in my own home, surrounded by the love of family who knew and appreciated me fully, planning work that felt meaningful and necessary, I understood that the risk had been worth taking. I had reclaimed not just my voice, but my sense of purpose and possibility. As I prepared for bed, I thought about tomorrow's workshop with domestic workers, about the manuscript I was editing for my second book, about Eleanor's doctor's appointment that I would attend as her advocate and companion. Each task represented a different facet of the life I'd built from the ashes of invisible service, a life grounded in recognition, respect, and the revolutionary idea that every person's contribution matters. At 63, I was finally living as the person I'd been meant to be all along, before years of economic necessity and social conditioning had convinced me to make myself small enough to fit into other people's expectations. The journey from invisibility to recognition had been long and sometimes painful, but it had led to a destination I could never have imagined when I first walked through the service entrance of that Manhattan penthouse. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities to use my voice, to share my story, to advocate for women who were still struggling to claim their own worth and dignity. Tonight, I fell asleep grateful for the circuitous path that had brought me home to myself, and hopeful for all the women who would follow similar journeys from shadow into light. The morning brought news that perfectly captured the ongoing ripples of courage, spreading outward from decisions made in pain and hope. Emma called before school, breathless with excitement about a project her teacher had assigned. "Grandma Margaret, we have to write about someone who made a difference in the world, and I want to write about you. Is that okay? My teacher said I could interview you about how you helped families understand each other better." Listening to my granddaughter's enthusiasm, I felt the deep satisfaction of knowing that the struggles I'd endured had created something beautiful and lasting. Not just changes in my own circumstances, but an example of courage and dignity that was being passed forward to the next generation. Of course, you can write about me, sweetheart, but remember, I'm not special because of anything extraordinary I did. I'm just a woman who learned to value her own voice and use it to help others. That's what makes you special, Grandma. You showed everyone that their voices matter, even when other people don't want to listen. As I hung up the phone, I realized that Emma had articulated something profound about the nature of courage and social change. The most important revolutions weren't always led by people with exceptional talents or unusual opportunities. Sometimes they were led by ordinary people who simply refused to accept that their perspectives didn't matter. My story had begun with a moment of recognition, seeing in David Caldwell's photograph the struggles my own grandson had faced, and a decision to speak truth despite the personal risk. That single act of courage had rippled outward, changing not just my own life, but the lives of the Caldwell family, the women I now mentored and advocated for, and the granddaughter who was learning that her voice would always have value. The years of invisible service in that Manhattan penthouse had been painful, but they had also been the foundation for everything that came after. The understanding of household dynamics that informed my consulting work, the recognition of power imbalances that shaped my advocacy, the deep empathy for struggle that connected me with women facing similar challenges. Have you ever worked silently for someone who overlooked you? Or do you know a woman whose story remains untold, whose contributions go unrecognized because of her social position or economic circumstances? Share your thoughts below. I'd love to hear from you. If this story touched your heart, leave a like and subscribe. It helps this message reach another woman who works with dedication and heart. To continue this emotional journey, we've prepared a special podcast filled with stories just as moving. You can find it here by clicking on the left. Thank you for joining me on this journey of the heart. I'll see you in the next story.